in the quiet English village of Crean. A chilling tragedy unfolded in 1975 that would shock the nation and forever change the way Britain viewed the nature of evil. Father Anthony Crean was a kind-hearted priest known for his compassion and willingness to forgive even those who had wronged him. Among them was a troubled young man named Patrick MacKay. Years earlier, MacKay had broken into the priest's home and stolen money. Instead of pressing charges, Father Crean forgave him, offering a chance at redemption. It was an act of mercy that would one day cost him his life. What followed was a story so disturbing it still haunts criminal psychology experts today. MacKay, once a neglected and angry child, had grown into a man consumed by rage, delusion, and darkness. The bond of forgiveness was shattered when he returned to Father Crean's doorstep, not seeking peace, but vengeance. This story is not just about a crime, it is about the human mind at its most fractured. It is about how childhood pain, unchecked violence, and societal neglect can merge into something truly terrifying. How does an innocent boy become capable of such horror? And could this tragedy have been prevented if the warning signs were taken seriously? In today's episode, we uncover the life of Patrick MacKay, his past, his obsessions, and the system that failed to stop him. If you find stories that explore the darker side of history and human psychology fascinating, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring more untold stories like this one to light. Long before the horror that gripped the village of Crean, the seeds of tragedy were quietly sown in the fragile mind of a young boy. Patrick MacKay's story began in a small, unremarkable home where love was replaced by fear and tenderness by violence. His father, an alcoholic who wrestled with his own demons, ruled the household with anger and fists. Nights were often filled with shouting, the sound of breaking glass, and the trembling silence that followed. Patrick, too young to understand the reasons behind the cruelty, learned to flinch at sudden movements and to hide behind closed doors. The bruises may have faded, but the fear never left him. It became part of who he was. When his father died suddenly, one might have expected a sense of relief, but for Patrick, it was the beginning of something far darker. The man who had terrified him was gone, yet the chaos remained inside his mind. Without guidance, affection, or stability, he began to lash out in ways that frightened those around him. Teachers described him as intelligent but deeply disturbed. He would switch from calm to violent in moments, as if something unseen had taken control. There were whispers of strange behavior, cruel games played on animals, bursts of rage followed by eerie calm. Even as a child, he seemed detached from the pain of others, as though empathy had been erased from his heart. Social workers visited the family, noting the boy's unpredictable nature and emotional scars. Doctors warned that without constant care and supervision, Patrick could grow into something dangerous. He was sent to special schools, then to psychiatric hospitals, where doctors tried to reach him, but every attempt seemed to fail. He learned to mimic normal emotions when it suited him, saying what the staff wanted to hear just to be released again. Behind the polite smile, there was only emptiness. Neighbors sometimes saw him wandering alone, staring into space, his expression cold and unreadable. He began talking about death, about power, and about how weakness disgusted him. These were not the thoughts of a mischievous youth, they were the early signs of a deep and growing disturbance. What frightened those who knew him most was not his anger, but his calm after it. It was as though violence had become his way of feeling alive. In time, Patrick developed a fascination with the darker parts of history, particularly with figures who used fear to control others. It was a way for him to make sense of his own pain by admiring those who inflicted it. But before that obsession fully consumed him, his childhood had already left an indelible mark. Every beating, every night of terror, Every moment of neglect carved another scar into his psyche. The boy who once cowered in corners would one day become the man others feared. What made Patrick's story even more tragic was how predictable it was. The warnings were there, written in every report, spoken by every psychiatrist, ignored by every authority who thought he was just another troubled child. No one wanted to believe that a boy so young could already be lost to darkness. But as the years went on, it became clear that something inside him had broken beyond repair. The transformation from victim to predator did not happen overnight. It grew slowly, quietly, like a shadow stretching across his soul. By the time he reached adulthood, the fragile child who once sought love and safety was gone. In his place stood a man who could no longer tell the difference between affection and control, remorse and satisfaction. The echoes of his father's cruelty still lived within him, shaping every thought, every impulse, until his own violence would mirror the very pain he had once endured. By the time Patrick MacKay reached his teenage years, the signs of danger were already impossible to ignore. His behavior grew more erratic, his temper more unpredictable, and his fascination with violence more unsettling. Those who worked with him, teachers, doctors, and social workers, had long realized that something inside him had fractured beyond what ordinary care could mend. Psychiatrists noted his lack of empathy, his pleasure in manipulation, and his chilling detachment when speaking of harm or death. They described him as a dangerous young man, one who could not distinguish right from wrong in the way most people could, yet who fully understood the fear his actions caused. Their reports were stark warnings written in cold medical language, each more urgent than the last. Still, the system failed him and failed those he would later harm. In the institutions where he was confined, Patrick learned not rehabilitation but performance. He discovered how to smile at doctors, how to say the words they wanted to hear, how to imitate remorse. Behind that calm exterior, his thoughts were dark and calculating. He studied the reactions of others, noting what frightened them, what made them trust him. It was as if he were rehearsing for a role, one that would one day allow him to walk free again. Each time he was released, officials believed they were giving him another chance at life. They saw a quiet young man with a troubled past but no real evidence of violence. The reports of cruelty to animals, the threats, and the strange obsessions were brushed aside as youthful misbehavior. But those who had seen his eyes when he was angry knew there was nothing childish about the darkness within him. Patrick was not improving. He was simply becoming better at hiding who he really was. He drifted between hospitals, halfway homes, and hostels, never staying long enough for anyone to truly understand him. Some workers described feeling uneasy in his presence, a sense of something cold and watchful. Others pitied him, thinking he was a lost soul, misunderstood and desperate for love. They could not see the quiet satisfaction he took in deceiving them. He began to believe he was smarter than the people who tried to help him, that rules and laws were things meant for others, not for him. The more the system released him, the more he learned that there were no real consequences for his actions. By the early 1970s, Patrick had grown into a man who had spent more time under supervision than in freedom, yet had learned nothing about remorse or control. Each release became a silent permission to continue down his dark path. Psychiatrists had written again and again that he posed a threat to society, that he lacked conscience, that his impulses could one day lead to tragedy. But bureaucracy moved slowly, and compassion without caution can be as dangerous as cruelty. So he walked out of the institutions again and again, free to return to a world that had no idea what he was capable of. As he wandered the streets of London and Kent, Patrick blended easily with the forgotten faces of the city's underbelly. No one knew that beneath his calm voice and polite demeanor lay a mind rehearsing the act of violence that would one day claim lives. The people who had once tried to save him had unwittingly taught him how to deceive, how to manipulate, and how to survive without conscience. Each failure of the system added another layer to the darkness that was already consuming him. The warnings had been clear. The evidence was there. Yet the doors of the institution kept opening, releasing him into a world unprepared for the storm that was coming. What began as an effort to help a damaged boy became the silent prelude to a series of tragedies that could have been prevented if only someone had truly believed what the doctors had written all along, that Patrick MacKay was not just troubled, but dangerously beyond saving. As Patrick MacKay moved further into adulthood, his fascination with violence and power took on a new, almost ritualistic focus, centering on the figure of Adolf Hitler and the ideology of Nazism. The young man, who had already spent years navigating the shadowy corners of his own psyche, found in these ideas a dangerous lens through which to view the world, a framework that validated his growing sense of superiority and the impulses that had been suppressed for so long. He immersed himself in books, articles, and memorabilia, constructing a private shrine to the symbols and leaders of the Third Reich, adorning himself with crude uniforms and armbands he made by hand, as if stepping into these items could somehow transfer the power he so desperately craved. Hitler became not merely a historical figure to Patrick, but a role model, a template for control and domination. He studied the speeches, the policies, and the meticulous organization of the regime, absorbing the ways in which authority could be wielded to command fear, obedience, and respect. Each detail of the Nazi philosophy offered him a blueprint, a justification for viewing himself as inherently superior and others as expendable or weak. The admiration was obsessive, extending beyond casual curiosity into a near spiritual devotion, as though the acts of a regime responsible for unprecedented atrocities could illuminate a path for his own twisted moral compass. Mackay's adoption of these beliefs was intertwined with his personal mythology. He saw himself as an outsider, a misunderstood genius, a man capable of transcending the limitations imposed by ordinary society, just as the Nazis had glorified strength and punished perceived weakness. He interpreted their actions as license to impose his own will upon those around him. In his The same philosophy that had justified the dominance of one race over another now validated his predatory instincts, offering a chilling narrative that merged ideology with impulse. The act of killing, the power to dominate life and death, became an extension of this self-conceived destiny, a way to prove his superiority in the most intimate and horrifying terms. The books and artifacts he collected were not idle curiosities, but instruments of obsession. Mackay would spend hours poring over photographs, maps, and accounts of the regime's operations, imagining himself in the role of orchestrator, the master of fate, untouchable and revered. The line between admiration and enactment blurred as he began to see the world through the lens of conquest and control, applying lessons from history to real-life scenarios that increasingly involved deception, manipulation, and ultimately violence. Every act of cruelty he carried out felt sanctioned by the distorted moral code he had absorbed, each victim a testament to his self-perceived dominance. Friends and acquaintances who encountered him during this period could sense a new intensity in his demeanor, a rigid certainty about the rightness of his own judgments, and a detached fascination with the suffering of others. He spoke often of history, philosophy, and power, but beneath the scholarly veneer lurked a predator who was calculating, remorseless, and increasingly emboldened by his own sense of destiny. The ideology he embraced did more than inspire. It provided him with a framework that rationalized every impulse, every transgression, every act of intimidation or harm. In Patrick's mind, there was no conflict between morality and action. The world itself was inherently weak, and his superiority over it justified any measure he deemed necessary. The combination of a troubled childhood, failed interventions, and an obsessive fixation on Nazism created a perfect storm in which violence, cruelty, and power were not only natural but inevitable. His identity became inseparable from the ideology he glorified, each reinforcing the other in a cycle that edged ever closer to real-world consequences, laying the psychological groundwork for the murders that would eventually shock the communities he encountered. By the early 1970s, Patrick MacKay had become a figure of quiet menace, moving through the streets and homes of London with a calculated mix of charm and menace that belied the darkness simmering beneath his surface. Between 1973 and 1975, he began to act on impulses that had long been gestating, targeting elderly women whose vulnerability mirrored the powerlessness he had once experienced as a child. Though his actions were driven less by need and more by an urge to assert control over life and death itself, these women were often kind, unsuspecting, and willing to offer a small measure of trust. And it was precisely this trust that Patrick twisted into a tool for his own gratification, manipulating the boundaries of social convention to gain access to their homes. The initial murders were committed with a chilling combination of patience and impulsivity. He would observe his victims, learning their routines, their habits, and their moments of solitude. Yet he rarely planned in elaborate detail, relying instead on a dark intuition honed through years of antisocial behavior and growing fascination with domination and cruelty. When the moment arrived, he acted decisively, striking with a mixture of physical force and cunning, leaving behind scenes that, at first glance, appeared innocuous. The deaths of these women were initially dismissed by authorities as the result of natural causes, a tragic but unremarkable passing that attracted little scrutiny. Patrick's careful attention to detail and his understanding of how society interpreted aging, illness, and death allowed him to mask his acts, feeding his sense of invincibility while sowing a false sense of security in the community around him. As the pattern continued, he developed a perverse ritual around these killings, experiencing a sense of power and emotional release that reinforced his detachment from conventional morality. After one murder, he might linger near the scene, observing reactions or simply savoring the knowledge that he had exerted absolute control over another human being. These acts were not impulsive in the raw sense. They were guided by a deep-seated need to assert mastery, to feel untouchable, and to reconcile the internal chaos he had carried since childhood. In this period, Patrick's relationship with the outside world became increasingly transactional. People were objects, opportunities, or obstacles, and the elderly women he selected embodied both trust and vulnerability, making them ideal participants in his unfolding narrative of domination. The lack of immediate investigation and the misattribution of these deaths to natural causes only emboldened him, reinforcing a belief that he could operate outside the reach of law and social norms. He became bolder, experimenting with techniques, observing how the absence of suspicion could be exploited, and reflecting on the reactions of neighbors, friends, and authorities in ways that strengthened the psychological scaffolding for future crimes. The interplay between his personal obsession with power and society's assumptions about age, frailty, and death created a blind spot that allowed him to continue unchecked, deepening his understanding of fear, control, and the fragility of human perception. During these years, Patrick also navigated the residual chaos of his own life: unstable housing, tenuous employment, and fractured relationships, yet none of these factors diminished his focus on his victims. Each encounter became an experiment, a dark rehearsal in which he tested the limits of his impulses against the constraints of the world, seeking out reactions, vulnerabilities, and loopholes that could be exploited. The emotional void within him, shaped by childhood trauma and institutional failures, was both a canvas and a catalyst for these acts, allowing him to detach from guilt and rationalize the unfolding violence. Ultimately, these murders set the stage for the climactic and highly publicized crime that would shock the nation: the seemingly ordinary deaths of elderly women. Initially overlooked, reflected a disturbing blend of patience, opportunism, and psychological calculation that characterized Patrick MacKay's early killing spree. They were not random or meaningless. They were the first real expressions of a dangerous pattern that would soon escalate, revealing the full extent of his capacity for manipulation, cruelty, and violence, and underscoring the chilling lesson that some predators operate in plain sight, their actions hidden behind assumptions and societal blind spots. Patrick MacKay's arrest following the murder of Father Anthony Crean marked the end of his violent spree, but also opened a window into the darker recesses of human behavior, revealing a trajectory shaped by trauma, neglect, and dangerous obsessions. In the quiet aftermath of that fateful day in 1975, authorities were confronted not only with the horror of a priest's death, but with a cascade of confessions that laid bare a string of crimes stretching back years, each one a testament to the lethal combination of childhood abuse, untreated mental illness, and systemic failures. MacKay's admissions shocked both the police and the public, as the seemingly ordinary neighborhoods he had walked through concealed a predator capable of calculated cruelty and astonishing manipulation, a man whose outward charm masked an inner world defined by fear, anger, and a relentless desire for control. His case serves as a haunting reminder of how deeply early trauma can shape an individual's actions when left unaddressed, and how societal systems, psychiatric institutions, law enforcement, and social services can inadvertently enable danger when warnings are ignored or mismanaged. Psychologists who had previously identified him as a high-risk individual were unable to ensure he received the intervention and treatment necessary to prevent further harm, and the consequences of this failure became tragically clear in the lives that were taken. Patrick's story is not merely a chronicle of individual evil. It is also a reflection of the gaps in understanding and support that can exist around mental health and criminal behavior. A sobering illustration of how the combination of neglect and untreated pathology can escalate into acts that shock communities and linger in memory for decades. Yet even amid the darkness, MacKay's confessions allowed for a measure of closure for the families of his victims and provided law enforcement with the clarity needed to connect previously unexplained deaths. They also offered psychologists and criminologists insights into the progression of violent behavior, the role of early abuse, and the importance of thorough intervention strategies. His case continues to be studied as an example of how environmental factors, ideology, and personal pathology can converge to produce destructive outcomes, offering lessons for prevention, awareness, and the careful monitoring of individuals who pose a risk to society. As we reflect on this chilling chapter, it is important to remember that understanding the roots of such violence is not an exercise in sympathy for the perpetrator, but a call to vigilance, compassion, and action, recognizing warning signs, supporting mental health, and ensuring accountability can help prevent history from repeating itself, protecting lives and communities from suffering the same fate. Thank you so much for joining us as we explored the dark but revealing story of Patrick MacKay. If you found this video insightful, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our future deep dives into history, true crime, and psychological analysis. Your support helps us continue to bring these stories to life, examining the past to better understand the complexities of human behavior today.